By 1987, Japanese game developer Square was in fairly dire straits. Having no big successes to their name, the company was approaching its last legs. Within the company, a man named Hironobu Sakaguchi had been pushing for years that they make a role-playing game, but had repeatedly been turned down, as higher-ups weren't convinced that an RPG would sell. However, after rival company Enix's RPG Dragon Quest popularized the genre in Japan in 1986, Square reconsidered this idea, and Sakaguchi was chosen to lead a 6-man dev group that would be known as Square's A-Team. Since the game could likely be the company's last, it was given a meaningful name: Final Fantasy. Except that last part is probably bullshit. Yeah, while Square has leaned into that story on occasion, Sakaguchi himself has downplayed the origins of the game's title in more recent years. Apparently, the team decided early on that they wanted a title that abbreviated to FF, since that was easy to pronounce in Japanese, and the game's original title was going to be Fighting Fantasy. But when it came to light that this name was already taken by a series of interactive game novels, an alternative was chosen instead. While Sakaguchi has said that the name is fitting given the back-to-the-wall situation the project was in, he also admits that, quote, any F word would have worked. I'll let you guys make your own joke there. Players start the game by choosing a party of 4 characters from a selection of 6 classes, all of which specialize in different styles of combat and/or spellcasting. A fighter, a monk, a thief, black and white mages, and a red mage, who acts as a jack-of-all-trades. The player can mix and match any 4 they want and are not limited to just one of each class. Want to party with 2 fighters? Go for it. Want to try to beat the game with a gang of 4 white mages? It's been done. An all-thief team? Knock yourself out, you lunatic. With their crew chosen, the player is put into the role of the prophesied Light Warriors, said to be destined to save the land from catastrophe. When the light from the world's 4 elemental orbs is stolen by the ancient and powerful elemental fiends, the earth itself begins to wither, and it's up to the Light Warriors to restore light to the orbs and save their world. The party is dropped in front of the town of Corneria, completely naked of any equipment or spells and with just 500 gold to their name. That 500 gold, depending on the squad chosen, is enough to outfit each character with the best armor and weapons from the shops, as well as a spell or 2. Heading to the castle, the party is told that Garland, a former knight gone rogue, has absconded with the princess to the Chaos Shrine, and the king begs the party to rescue her. The team makes their way to the shrine, defeats Garland, and returns the princess home, where they are given thanks from the king and a mysterious loot from the princess. After making a short excursion to Matoya's cave, where they find the witch lamenting her stolen crystal eye but unable to immediately offer any aid, they continue east to the port town of Provoca, which is currently being terrorized by a band of pirates. The troop defeats them soundly, and fun fact, the pirates have the lowest HP of any enemy in the game. And as a peace offering, the pirates grant the heroes their ship, allowing them to continue their quest across the seas. To the southeast, across the Inner Sea, the gang finds Elfland, where a boatload of expensive new spells and equipment are available. The people of Elf Castle are currently seeking a way to awaken their prince from a sleeping curse placed on him by a dark elf. And after heading north, the party finds an abandoned castle with a lone king residing, who asks that they retrieve his stolen crown from within the marsh cave, in return for a way to wake the cursed prince. Once the party finally perseveres and retrieves the stolen crown, they return to the king, only to find he was actually the dark elf Astos in disguise. Our heroes defeat him and loot Matoya's stolen crystal eye from his corpse, and upon returning it to its rightful owner, she grants them the means to finally awaken the elf prince from his slumber. As gratitude, the prince hands over the mystic key, as it was prophesied that he would do so, hence why evil forces put the prince to sleep to begin with. With key in hand, the Light Warriors retrieve some TNT and take it to the Dwarf Cave so Narek can finally blow open a canal, granting the crew's ship passage to the outer sea. Upon sailing west to the town of Melmond, they find its people plagued by dying earth, as well as their chapel in ruins, the handiwork of a vampire that now lurks in the nearby Earth Cave. The squad heads to the cave, and deep within it, they defeat the vampire. But the land's rot does not cease. It seems the vampire was not the one to blame, and upon speaking to the sage Sarda in a cave to the far west, the party is granted a magic rod that will open the way deeper into the Earth Cave, where the true source of the Earth's decay lies in wait. At the bottom of the Earth Cave, the heroes confront the Lich, the Fiend of Earth, responsible for the land's dire state, as well as the loss of the Earth Orb's light. After a hard-fought battle, the Lich is slain and the orb restored, and they prepare for the next destination, Crescent Lake in the southeast. There, the warriors confer with the Circle of Sages, 12 prophets led by Lucan, who originally foresaw the coming of the Fiends and the Light Warriors. The sages grant the heroes a canoe with which to navigate the nearby rivers, and the party takes to the river valleys to find the Gurgu volcano, where the Fiend of Fire is said to reside. The volcano proves to be a challenging ordeal, but the gang prevails in defeating Kari, the Fiend of Fire, and restoring light to the Fire Orb. Hearing of an ancient piece of technology that could aid them in their quest, the heroes continue their river tour until finding the Ice Cave, and upon defeating the monsters inside, they find a floater, which they use in the Ryukon Desert to unearth a hidden airship, giving them free reign of the world. With the airship, the crew finds the Cardia Islands and meets the Dragon King Bahamut, and after retrieving proof of their courage from the Castle of Ordeal, Bahamut bestows the heroes with newfound power. From there, the group visits the villages of Gaia and Onrak, where they learn of the Sunken Shrine, residence of the Fiend of Water. Rescuing an abducted fairy from a desert caravan, they are rewarded with Oxy Ale, allowing them to breathe underwater, and make their way to the shrine. With the support of some local mermaids, the heroes battle the water fiend Kraken in the depths of the ocean to restore light to the water orb. With only one orb remaining to be restored, the party learns of the ancient Lefean culture, who crafted the Tower of Mirage in ancient times. Unbeknownst to many, these people still reside in a remote village, speaking a language long thought dead. With a stone slab they discovered in the sunken shrine, the team is able to have the language deciphered by the scholar Une, and they speak to the Lefeanish people to receive a chime that will allow them to enter Mirage Tower, said to house the final fiend. Their trip through Mirage Tower soon meets a dead end, however, requiring a cube of ancient tech to transport them to the floating castle. Searching a waterfall cavern near Onrak, they find a robot who bestows the cube upon them, and the team returns to Mirage Tower to enter the floating castle. Atop the world, they see the powers of the fiends converging at a center point, the Chaos Shrine, where their adventure began. After defeating Tiamat, the Fiend of Wind, light is finally restored to the Wind Orb. With all 4 orbs restored, and after a quick detour to have the dwarven smithy forge Excalibur from a piece of adamantite, the heroes confer with the Circle of Sages. They finally learn the source of the fiends, which lies in the Chaos Shrine of 2,000 years past. If nothing is done in the past, the fiends will continue to return again and again. A time gate lies in the center of the Chaos Shrine, and with light restored to the 4 orbs, the gate can be opened. And so the party dives through time to finally vanquish the fiends once and for all. Along the way, the party fights the fiends of the past, and discover their path forward blocked by a mysterious slab. As it turns out, the loot given to them by Princess Sarah is the key that allows them to open the way, and once at the deepest depths of the Chaos Shrine of the past, they're shocked to find Garland waiting for them. As it turns out, when the heroes defeated Garland, the powers of the 4 fiends, personified as a being known only as Chaos, possessed his form and transported him back in time. In return, Garland would release the fiends upon the world of 2,000 years ago. This creates a time loop that can only be cut by defeating Chaos here and now, ensuring that the fiends never resurface in the future. The heroes ultimately prevail, and then return to their own time, where their adventure becomes naught but legend, a legend with no beginning or end. While fairly quaint by modern standards, as far as the era was concerned, Final Fantasy's plot was more ambitious than almost anything seen before. If this were most other 80s games, the game likely would have been over as soon as the player rescued Princess Sarah from Garland about an hour or so in. After all, Mario, Zelda, and Dragon Quest all place rescuing a princess as the ultimate goal, but for Final Fantasy this was just the prologue. Once the player crossed the now-repaired bridge to the north of Canaria, they were greeted with opening credits. The game had just begun. In terms of scope and content, Final Fantasy might just be the largest game yet created in 1987. The game has the characters completing interconnected objectives in order to progress, and doesn't simply end with something as simple as rescuing a princess. The finale's twist, with Garland and his time loop, was also something uncommon to games at the time. Sure, Metal Gear had a twist betrayal in its final hours, but that's a trope that had been seen in fiction countless times, and heck, in real life too. Garland and the time loop, as confusing as it may be, was something considerably more unique. So that's the story, but what's the game like? Well, it's an RPG, or role-playing game, and that's a genre with very well-established traits by now. But in the 80s, RPGs were not a popular genre, especially not in video games. Dungeons & Dragons had a cult following in the States, but that was a tabletop game that allowed players to essentially build their own stories and worlds. Video games like Ultima also existed, and Dragon Quest had finally managed to popularize the genre in Japan. But the most popular video games of the time were far and away action-oriented arcade-style affairs that relied on a lot of twitch gameplay, not charts and number crunching. Put yourself in the shoes of an average person in the 1980s picking up an RPG for the first time. Your characters are walking around in a top-down map, and then suddenly the screen goes all and you're moved to a completely different screen layout with a bunch of still sprites and menus thrown in your face. You may be able to piece together that this is some kind of battle, but nothing is happening and you don't directly control your characters. You simply tell them what to do from a menu and then hope for the best. It's stuff we take for granted these days as just part and parcel of the genre, but compared to games like Mario and Mega Man, everything is a lot more abstract. It's no wonder RPGs had trouble breaking into the mainstream for so long. But as far as RPGs go, what sets Final Fantasy apart from its contemporaries? Well, Square wanted an RPG that could directly compete with Dragon Quest without just being a knockoff clone of it. So Square ended up pretty much ripping off Dungeons & Dragons instead. Yeah, Sakaguchi cites Ultima and Wizardry as his two biggest influences, but the battle system, its rules, and basically its entire bestiary were just lifted wholesale from D&D. True, D&D's monsters were mainly cobbled together from various cultures and mythologies, but you see this enemy here? Well, in the Japanese version, it's literally just a beholder. Square had to change it, even in future Japanese re-releases and remakes, because they realized that beholders were a D&D specific monster that they could get sued for using. Oops. Final Fantasy also lifts its multi-man party from D&D as opposed to Dragon Quest's singular main character, and it even incorporates elemental affinities into the battle system, something only D&D was doing at the time. But even with the very blatant influences it's borrowing from, Final Fantasy is still a finely crafted RPG. Also, in contrast to Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy really ups the ante when it comes to presentation. Dragon Quest may have had the king of boys manga Akira Toriyama behind its artwork, but the battles were presented in somewhat stale first-person perspectives with just a view of whatever monster you were fighting and a bunch of text boxes. FF's battles are still chock full of text to be sure. I mean, look at this battle screen, it's definitely pretty cluttered. But the battles are viewed side-on, with monsters on one side and your party members on the other, and you can see your characters performing each action and actually swinging their weapons with each attack. The monster sprites are also a far cry from Dragon Quest. Akira Toriyama's art strikes as charming due to its simple shapes and sense of fun and whimsy, whereas Final Fantasy's art, provided by painter and illustrator Yoshitaka Amano, is gritty and rich in detail. And even though the monster sprites are completely static in-game, they do such a wonderful job of adapting Amano's complex art into 8-bit form that most won't even mind. While FF1 looks primitive today, its graphics, particularly the flashy and complex spell animations, were some of the most impressive of its time, especially for a genre not exactly known for being visually groundbreaking. The music also went above and beyond. Final Fantasy has a whopping for the time 13 individual music tracks, composed by Nobuo Uematsu, and this dude is basically the John Williams of video games. Few musicians in the space have demonstrated such a range of diverse styles while maintaining such consistency and quality. And even limited to the simple beeps and boops of the NES sound chip, he managed to create complex and kind of beautiful music. While FF1 was not his first project, it was the one that earned him mainstream attention, and several of the tracks he composed here would go on to become classics among FF fans, such as Matoya's Cave, Gurgu Volcano, and my personal favorite, The Sunken Shrine. Several other pieces from FF1 would become recurring motifs throughout the franchise, such as the Victory fanfare, opening theme, and of course, the prelude. Which, fun fact, was a last-minute addition to the game written in about 10 minutes. The game's sequence of events play out in largely linear fashion. The Gurgu Volcano and Ice Cave can be done in either order, and the Castle of Ordeal and Cardia Islands are completely optional. But otherwise, the player has a set order of objectives the whole time. Anytime the player isn't in battle, they can open a world map by holding B and pressing select. Being an old-school RPG, information is dished out entirely by NPCs. There are no cutscenes in the modern sense. The player is meant to piece together clues from the small amount of dialogue provided, as well as their own exploration. Another symptom of being an old-school RPG is that not a lot of information is provided to the player in regards to how the game works. There's no tutorial, nor in-game item descriptions. Granted, back in the day, this is the type of stuff that would be laid out in the instruction manual. Hell, back then, manuals were essentially full-blown strategy guides. But nowadays, it's unreasonable to expect the player to have the original manual on hand. You're best off just using a walkthrough with a game like this. Final Fantasy also includes one of the earliest examples of a bonus minigame. While sailing, the player can hold A and mash B to begin a sliding puzzle game that can earn the party some pocket change. Basic game mechanics are about what you'd expect. Characters have battle options such as attack, magic, item, and flee. Certain classes can only equip certain types of weapons and learn certain spells, and some classes can't learn spells at all. The team has a shared inventory for quest-related and recovery items, and each character has 8 total slots for carrying equipment, 4 each for weapons and armor, and that includes the ones they have equipped. In addition to gold, characters gain experience points, or EXP, at the end of each battle, and passing certain EXP thresholds will cause them to level up to a possible maximum of 50, which will increase their stats. The player can rearrange the order of their characters in battle by pressing select on the map. And unlike later entries, this choice is not inconsequential. Characters at the top of the formation are more likely to be attacked than characters at the bottom. Each character class has specific specialties that they can use to contribute to the party. Fighters can use the most powerful equipment and have the highest defense, but can be incredibly expensive to maintain due to the price of useful weapons and armor. Monks, in this game called Black Belts, are like the inverse. They have limited equipment and are incredibly fragile, but are easily the hardest hitters in the game, and after reaching level 7 or so, are actually stronger without any equipment, meaning they're cheap to maintain and can hold excess pieces of gear you find until you reach a shop to pawn them off at. Thieves are sort of the weak link of the classes, to be honest. There is no mechanic for stealing items in this game, so the thief's advantage is his high speed stat and increased chance of successfully fleeing. His equipment options are middling, somewhere between the monk and the fighter. The white and black mages use opposite schools of magic spells, white for healing and defense, black for offense and debuffs. Their equipment options are limited, but a competent black mage can clear out large swaths of enemies more efficiently than any other class, and a good white mage is a must for almost any party setup, as they're the most consistent and reliable source of recovering health. Finally, the red mage is a jack of all trades. His equipment options are about on par with the thief, and he can learn spells from both the black and white schools, albeit with a more limited pool of options, especially when it comes to the most advanced spells. A red mage can round out a party that maybe doesn't want to sacrifice pure physicality by including a black mage, or wants an additional spellcaster that they wouldn't get from a thief or a monk. Casting spells requires magic points, or MP, and spells are split into 8 levels, with 4 spells available in each. However, characters can only learn a maximum of 3 spells per level, requiring the player to decide which spells are most important. Instead of every spell drawing from the same singular MP total, the game instead lifts the Vancian magic rules from D&D. Each level of spellcasting has a pool of charges that determine how many times a spell of that level can be cast, with the character gaining more total charges as they level up. Battles occur at random as the player walks around the world map. Basically, any area that isn't a town or castle has the possibility of battles popping up. There are also certain specific tiles that will always trigger a battle when stepped on. This was all a result of technical limitations, as the NES wasn't powerful enough to have enemies visibly wandering the maps. So instead, battles take place on their own dedicated screens, and commence in a turn-based fashion. Each battle also has the small chance of being either a preemptive attack, wherein the party is granted a free turn at the start, or an ambush, wherein the enemies get a free turn instead. Players begin each turn by selecting each hero's desired action and, if necessary, targets all at once, which then play out alongside the enemy's actions in an order determined by each combatant's speed stat, with a bit of luck thrown in. Actions during battle consist of attacking physically with their weapon, casting a spell, drinking one of various potions, using the secondary effect of a weapon or piece of armor where possible, or attempting to flee. Whether a flee attempt is successful is determined by the character's luck stat, or at least it's supposed to. Battles are considered victorious when the entire enemy party is vanquished, while a game over occurs when all 4 members of the player's forces are either KO'd or petrified. Upon victory, players are rewarded a set amount of gold and EXP depending on the type and number of enemies defeated. Oh, and when you start the game up, you're gonna want to set the respawn rate to the max level to really punch up the text speed, otherwise every battle will last forever. Being Square's first attempt at an RPG, there are a lot of now expected quality of life features and basic mechanics that one now takes for granted that are completely absent in this one. Enemies don't drop items, there are no MP restoring items, revival and depetrifying spells can only be used outside of battle, and saving the game can only be done by resting at an inn or using a tent or cabin. And even then, that only recovers HP and MP, not KO or status effects. You can't swap quickly from character to character on inventory screens, meaning each character has to be checked one at a time. The game also doesn't immediately communicate any stat gains or losses from equipment, meaning you have to manually check your stats before and after taking up each new weapon or piece of armor. And probably most infamous of all, if a character is told to target a specific enemy and said enemy dies before that character's turn plays out, they will not automatically move on to a different target. They will attack the empty space left behind, essentially wasting their turn. In regards to this point, I've heard it argued, fairly well I should add, that this actually adds to the strategy of each fight, by making the player try to predict how much damage each character will do, and thus choose their targets appropriately, rather than just mashing the confirm button over and over. But I still definitely think incorporating an auto-retarget function was a net positive for future entries. Oh, and the game also does this really annoying thing where if a character was poisoned in battle, their position in the party will be moved to the bottom when the battle is over. I can see why they thought this was a good idea. Characters at the bottom are less likely to be targeted, and so this is presumably to protect the poisoned character, but you know damn well I'm just gonna cure the poisoned character first thing, and they're just gonna get poisoned again in the next battle anyway because the Marsh Cave fucking sucks, so stop trying to help, for God's sake, you're not helping! And it's due to a combination of both its primitive status and some rather sadistic game design that Final Fantasy ends up being a very difficult game. Enemy mobs can appear in groups of up to 9 compared to the party's 4, and even though turn order is meant to be determined by the speed stats, I swear the game just lets every enemy go first about 90% of the time. Early on, difficulty is largely just going to be determined by level ups and equipment, but the Marsh Cave in particular represents the game's first real spike in difficulty. It's the first real dungeon, the Chaos Shrine hardly counts, and at this point of the game, your heroes likely can't even afford all the equipment and spells available in town, and can only cast a few spells before running out of MP. Enemies in the cave tend to swarm and can hit like dump trucks. And to make it all worse, some enemies can poison you just by touching you, and others are all but immune to physical attacks, requiring that you use even more spells. Poison can only be cured via the Pure spell, which the player isn't guaranteed to be able to afford at this point, or Pure Potions, which are finite and also cost precious gold. Clearing the Marsh Cave will likely take multiple trips, and considering the cave itself is quite the trek from the nearest inn, you will likely have to use up several healing items to save more walking. Unless, of course, you want to sacrifice more expensive tents and cabins to heal right on its doorstep. And the game's difficulty wouldn't be such an issue if, well, the game worked. About a third of the game's spells, equipment, etc. either don't work as intended or don't work at all, and it's incredible how little I'm exaggerating when I say this. Discussing all of it would likely be enough for an entirely new video on its own, so I'll try to rattle off the most notable examples as quickly as I can. There are several weapons in the game that are meant to have elements or species-specific properties, making them more effective against enemies of the appropriate type. This is balanced out by these weapons having fairly middling stats otherwise. However, these special properties don't actually work, so the weapons are completely useless. The expensive house item is meant to act as a portable inn, healing the party's HP and MP and allowing them to save. Now, it does do all that, just in the wrong order. It saves the game before it restores the party's MP, meaning if you use one and then turn off the game, you'll have wasted the item without actually recovering your MP. The only way around this is to immediately use a tent or cabin to save again after the house restores your MP. Critical hit rates don't work as intended at all. Each weapon is supposed to have a unique critical hit rate, but instead it's just programmed so that later game weapons will always have higher crit rates. This makes one particular sword useless, as it's meant to have low stats but an incredibly high crit rate, but it just doesn't. The monk actually gets his magic defense stat lowered when he's upgraded to a master. It's honestly not clear if this is intended or a bug. The mute spell is meant to make a character unable to cast spells, but for some reason it also makes you unable to use potions or items. The intelligence stat literally does nothing. The spells Temper, Saber, Lock, and Exfer literally do nothing. The Lock 2 spell works, but it does the opposite of what it's supposed to. The Run command is supposed to check the luck stat of the character making the attempt in order to determine success, but for some reason it checks the luck stat of your last 2 characters instead. There is at least one bug that works to the player's benefit. The Heal 3 spell recovers double the amount of HP it's meant to. They had to give us one at least, I guess. And those are just the ones I could easily sum up. If you really get into the nitty-gritty of the game, you'll find even more. And the worst part of this is, without someone pointing any of these bugs out, the player has no way of knowing they're even there. Glitchy games are still being sold today, sure, but at least bugs nowadays are obvious. Given the game's blunt nature and botched programming, most players may be tempted to just overcorrect by grinding out levels and gold for hours before making any significant trek. After all, saving can only be done at inns, and you don't want progress in a dungeon to be undone by one bad roll of the proverbial dice. This results in an experience that can seem pretty tedious, and it's a complaint you hear a lot with these older Final Fantasy games, that they're too grindy. And I can definitely understand why those people could come to that conclusion. Weapons and spells are all incredibly pricey once you're past the first 2 towns or so, and any random, unremarkable enemy encounter could potentially go south at a moment's notice. But the thing that I think people forget in light of how the genre is designed nowadays is that these old-school RPGs didn't expect you to be able to clear dungeons in a single go. Multiple trips are expected, as you constantly return to town to heal up and save. Dungeons weren't just waypoints placed on a map out of obligation to the genre. They were a real risk, they were a venture, an ordeal that you were meant to approach with courage and with caution. To see what I mean, the next time you pick up one of these old Final Fantasy games, here's something you can do to make it way better. Don't do any grinding. Seriously. At any given point, just buy the most essential equipment and spells you can afford, and then head to wherever your next objective is. If and when your characters start to take a beating and run low on resources, turn back to the nearest inn. Use whatever gold you gained during the trip to buy anything you couldn't afford the first time, rest and save, and try again. In short, always at least make the attempt to move the story along, even if you may not make it in a single trip. Just walking in circles around each town until you've grinded out enough battles to afford everything will only serve to make the whole experience incredibly dull. If the game wants you to head to that cave, then goddammit head to the frickin' cave. This way, even though you are still technically spending around the same amount of time gathering gold and leveling up, it doesn't feel as long because you're doing so in a much more organic way and are always making at least some sort of progress. The game's dungeons are even designed to accommodate this style of play. Again, we use the Marsh Cave to illustrate. You enter the cave in the center of its winding first floor, with stairways at the north and south ends. Both paths lead to dead ends, both with plenty of treasures to collect, but only the south end contains the item you need to progress the story. No matter which path you choose to take first, you'll have to pass by the cave's entrance on your return trip to explore the other path, giving you the perfect opportunity to leave and rest up before clearing out the other side. Hell, the very fact that there are treasures in the Marsh Cave that require you to return later with the Mystic Key is a much more blatant way of telling the player that multiple trips per dungeon is actually the intention here. The Gurgu Volcano is another good example of this sort of dungeon design. It's 6 floors deep, but on each one, the entrance and exit are actually pretty close to one another. It's only when you decide to go after the treasures that the game makes you go off the beaten path. The first floor is just an empty crater, and the second is just a straight shot to the next floor, but with a bunch of loot in a winding room to the north that you can choose to completely ignore on return visits. There are 2 more floors that have no treasures at all, one of which is pretty much a straight-up maze, which in itself also lends itself to this multiple trips style of play, since you're more likely to remember the correct path on return visits. The final floor starts you off in the middle, with treasures and the boss scattered in the various corners, leaving you to decide to explore only the sections that matter to you at the moment. And all the while, the dungeon is strewn with these lava floors, which deal chip damage as you walk on them, but also remove the possibility of random encounters entirely. So it's up to you to decide which option would be less risky in the long run. The game is actively encouraging you to play the game in bursts like this, and to me, it honestly feels like the intended, and frankly much more fun way to play this game. Yeah, it can seem pretty grindy if you choose to grind, but if you just do what the game expects you to do instead and play it safe with your trips to and from each inn, suddenly it all starts to click a whole lot more. This risk-reward style of play is a big facet of the appeal of old-school RPGs. Is it a lot riskier to play the game like this? Yes, but is it much more engaging and entertaining than just walking in circles for hours at a time? Absolutely. There is unfortunately one pretty notable exception to this style of level design. The Ice Cave is on paper a pretty short dungeon, but the method of traversing it requires you to descend to the bottom floor by dropping down a one-way hole, and then find an alternate path back up to reach the item you need. From there, the only way out is to drop down into the bottom floor again and make your way up to the exit one more time. This means, yes, if you actually want the item you came here to get, you'll be required to traverse the bottom floor of the dungeon no less than twice on the same trip. While it is true that you can exit to rest and save just before grabbing the item and dropping down, it's the only dungeon in the game that doesn't allow for the sort of turn back whenever you want to style of play, as there are legitimate points of no return that get in the way of that. This is also before the party has access to the warp or exit spells. And to make it all worse, the dungeon is chock full of enemies that can cast petrification and instant death on you. Outside of the Marsh Cave, I'd say the Ice Cave is the most difficult portion of the game, despite being one of the shortest. Avoiding game overs here is a total crapshoot, and the dungeon's design makes retreating to the nearest inn a lot less viable than any other point in the game, even the final dungeon. Thankfully, right after the Ice Cave, the difficulty does mellow out once the party acquires the airship. It's at this point that the player is given the opportunity to complete a side quest that will grant them class upgrades for increased stats and a wider selection of spells and equipment. The fighter becomes a knight, granting him access to low-level white magic for some extra healing. The white, black, and red mages become wizards, with a more robust and advanced spell selection and some new equipment. The thief receives the biggest boost from the class change, becoming a ninja, with a significantly larger pool of equipment and access to low-level black magic. In contrast, the monk receives almost no real advantages from the upgrade, but the monk is honestly so overpowered to begin with that he doesn't really need the boost anyway. In addition to the class upgrade, this is also the point in the game where the player starts finding equipment that can cast spells without the use of MP. These items can be used an infinite number of times, as long as the player never gets rid of them, and since some of these cast useful spells like Heal, Bolt 2, and even an instant death spell, there's really no reason not to use them almost every turn. The game can still throw a couple curveballs at a moment's notice, but these items help massively in finally making the player feel more in control of each battle's outcome. Also, I didn't have a good place to mention this, but there's an infamous enemy in FF1 called Warmech, which has the highest stats of any enemy in the game, including bosses. It has a measly 5% chance of showing up in a single room of the game right before the boss of the floating castle, and so it's meant to be a bit of a rare sight. Back in the day, Nintendo held an actual contest for people to find Warmech and send photo proof of it. When I got to that room, guess who I immediately ran into? Twice. Where's my fucking prize, Nintendo? When all was said and done, Final Fantasy would miraculously become the company's first big hit, and essentially single-handedly save Square from bankruptcy. The game would be a big hit when it launched in Japan in 1987, although not quite as popular as Dragon Quest. And once it was released in North America in 1990, it would outsell both its Japanese counterpart and the American release of Dragon Quest, which actually kinda sorta flopped over here. In North America in particular, Final Fantasy was the first RPG to really stick, just a year after Nintendo had pushed so hard for the English release of Dragon Quest, or Dragon Warrior, rather. The game would see countless follow-ups and remakes, both of which we'll be discussing in due time. The American release of the game also saw a few instances of censorship, in addition to the Not Beholder being changed into something a little less lawsuity. Namely, all the churches were changed into clinics, complete with their crosses being swapped out with hearts. The localizers were seemingly also forbidden from directly referencing death, so the death spell had its name changed to Rub, which somehow sounds more suggestive, and Garland, rather humorously, threatens to knock us all down. As for my recommendation, unless you specifically want to experience the history of the original game in its original form, this is not the version of FF1 you should play. The archaic nature of its menus and shoddy programming means it's a rough one to get through nowadays. I'll get more into the later versions in future videos, but to sum it up, I personally think the PS1 version strikes a good balance between the old-school appeal of the original and the quality of life improvements of later entries to make the whole thing run a lot smoother without completely sacrificing what gave the original game its heart. Final Fantasy definitely wore its inspirations on its sleeve, but it still did a great job at translating the tabletop RPG experience into a digital form. And given the franchise's massive popularity later on, I don't really blame people for believing that bogus story about the origins of the name Final Fantasy. Ignoring the irony of a game called Final Fantasy having a million sequels, it is sort of an inspiring tale, don't you think? And I think the reason people choose to believe that old rumor is because if there's one thing you can say about this franchise, it makes one hell of a story.